So let's start. It's 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Thanks all for joining. It's a pleasure to have a new workshop this year, and we have a great program. So just a couple of announcements before we start. Remember that this is live streaming on YouTube, including the breaks. Just in case you want to say something that shouldn't be live. We have 1 hour per paper, 50 minutes per paper, 20 minutes per presentation, 15 minutes for discussion. And then we have a Q&A session for 15 minutes, and then a 10-minute break between papers. The chat is live, so co-authors are free to answer questions. Personally, I think that may be distracting, so you may want to save some of them to answer in the Q&A sessions. We're going to be monitoring with Marcos and Arvin the chat to collect some of the questions anyways to the Q&A session. So I don't think I'm forgetting anything. Marcos, Arvin, if you want to add something. Okay.
Well, that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Fantastic. All right, so let's start with the first paper. Nicolas, are you presenting? Do you want to share the screen?
Yeah.
So Nicolas is presenting monetary policy and wealth effects, the role of risk and heterogeneity. You have 20 minutes. The screen is yours.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks the organizers for including this paper in the program. We're very happy to be here. So today I'm going to talk about monetary policy and wealth effects, the role of risk and heterogeneity. This is joint work with Dejaneer Silva. There is a long tradition in monetary economics that considers the role of wealth effects, that is the revaluation of real and financial assets, on the response of the economy to monetary policy. Keynes himself emphasized the importance of the revaluation of financial assets in the monetary transmission mechanism. Moreover, we have a large literature documenting the importance of these effects. We have evidence that monetary policy affects risk premia on stocks and bonds, and we have evidence that policymakers care about the wealth effects generated by the revaluation of financial assets. However, incorporating these channels theoretically represents a challenge for standard models. The standard approach does not feature risk premia, so it features counterfactual asset pricing dynamics. And models that do incorporate richer asset pricing dynamics have to be solved using complex methods, such as high-order approximations or global methods, which give us limited analytical results and limited economic intuition about the role of these channels. So what we do in this paper is to provide a new framework with rich asset pricing dynamics and heterogeneous portfolios while preserving the tractability of the standard New Keynesian model. The model has two main ingredients, rare disasters and private debt, and the contributions of the paper are twofold. First, we provide a full analytical characterization of the wealth effects generated by monetary policy. We linearize our setting around the stationary equilibrium with positive disaster risk. This allows us to study time-varying risk premium in a setting using the tools of the standard textbook models. And moreover, and despite being stylized, our model is able to capture key asset pricing moments quantitatively, such as the term premium, the equity premium, and the heterogeneous response of borrowers and savers we observe in the data. Because of this success, we use the model to quantitatively assess the role of time-varying risk and private debt, and we find that they jointly account for more than 80% of the initial response of aggregate consumption. So let me briefly describe the model. We set up a model in continuous time. We have two types of households, impatient borrowers and patient savers. Prices are sticky, so we'll get a standard New Keynesian Phillips curve. We assume that intermediate good producers face aggregate disaster risk. In particular, we assume that the economy can be hit by a shock with a Poisson intensity lambda t that permanently reduces the productivity of all firms in the economy. In order to capture the time-varying component of risk premium, we assume that lambda t can be represented by a function lambda that depends on the nominal interest rate. This should be interpreted as capturing the monetary transmission through financial intermediaries' exposure to interest rate risk. In fact, a recent paper by Schularik, Terstegen, and Gard in the NBER Insights finds empirically that a contractionary monetary shock significantly increases the probability of a financial crisis. Our modeling choice captures this channel in a reduced form. Moreover, there is a benefit of making this assumption, which is that in a linearized setting, we have only one extra relevant parameter in the equilibrium, epsilon lambda, which we can discipline using asset pricing data. Finally, there is a government that says fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal side, we have a sales tax, lump sum transfers, and long-term debt. On the monetary side, we have a standard interest rate rule that satisfies the Taylor principle. Households in this economy choose consumption, labor, short-term, and long-term bonds. Borrowers are always against their borrowing constraints, so they only choose consumption and labor, but savers satisfy two Euler equations. First, we have the Euler with respect to short-term bonds, which has an intertemporal substitution channel, which is standard, and also a precautionary savings motive because of their exposure to disaster risk. In what follows, I will denote variables with an asterisk, the variables in the disaster state. There is also an Euler with respect to long-term bonds, which can be expressed in terms of the excess return on long-term bonds, RLT, which depends on the price of risk, which is in units of the marginal utility loss of consumption of the savers in case of a disaster, and the quantity of risk, which is the price, the change in the price of the long-term bonds in case of a disaster, where QLT is the price of long-term bonds. So let me briefly talk about the solution method, which is crucial for tractability. The standard approach would be to approximate the economy around a non-stochastic steady state without disaster risk and without monetary risk. In that case, if we want to obtain a time-varying risk component, we would need to approximate the economy at least up to third order. Instead, we linearize the economy around a stationary equilibrium with positive disaster risk, but no monetary risk. In the stationary equilibrium, all variables are constant in each state. This way, we are able to capture time-varying precautionary savings and risk premia in a linear setting. So the focus of the paper is on analyzing the channels of transmission of monetary policy, intertemporal substitution, precautionary savings, and wealth effects. We do this in two steps. First, we provide the characterization of the equilibrium path of output and inflation in terms of equilibrium paths of policy variables, that is, the nominal interest rate and lump sum transfers. In particular, we assume that the nominal interest rate follows an AR1 process with decay rate psi-m. Later, I will connect the equilibrium paths to the Taylor rule I showed you at the beginning, and I will show you how to compute the sequence of monetary shocks that generate those paths. But before jumping to the characterization of output and inflation, let me show you some expressions for asset prices, which is one of the main contributions of this paper. So monetary policy affects the valuation of assets in this economy. At the core of the mechanism, we have the price of risk, PDT, which depends on the size of the disaster shock, which is in units of marginal utility of consumption of the savers, and the change in the probability of a disaster. Once we have the price of risk, we can price any financial asset in this economy. For example, the price of long-term bonds depends on the sequence of short-term rates, as in the expectations hypothesis, and a term premium, which depends on the price of risk and an asset-specific loading, RL. Similarly, we can price the stock of the intermediate good producers, which depends on the dividends and a discount rate, which has a the price of risk and an asset-specific loading, RS. So what these expressions are showing is that agents in this economy, in particular the savers, require a compensation to hold aggregate risk in this economy. So now I characterize the aggregate dynamics. We can characterize the dynamics of output and inflation with three sets of equations. First, we have an aggregate Euler equation, which is similar in many respects to the standard one with some important differences. First, it depends on a macro EIS, which has been extensively studied in the literature. Then we have a parameter delta, which governs discounting or compounding of output. And we have an independent term, VT, that affects output, that impacts output independently of changes in aggregate demand. Both delta and V depend on our disaster risk and the private debt. Then we have the standard New Keynesian-Phillips curve. And finally, we introduce an intertemporal aggregate budget constraint. This is the sum of the budget constraint of all agents in the economy. The left-hand side is the present value of aggregate consumption discounted using the discount rate in the stationary equilibrium. On the right-hand side, we have the revaluation of government bonds and the present value of the agent's disposable income. Because the right-hand side is going to be an important component of the characterization of equilibrium, I'm going to denote it by omega 0. You should think of omega 0 as being proportional to the household's change in wealth. It turns out that given the equilibrium path of policy variables, these three equations are necessary and sufficient to find the equilibrium path of output and inflation. Of course, if one wants to also calculate the equilibrium path of the policy variables, we would need to introduce back the policy rules. But in what follows, I'm going to take the path of policy rules as given, and I will introduce them later to close the equilibrium determination. So I'm ready to describe the channels of transmission. Output in equilibrium is given by the sum of four terms. First, we have an intertemporal substitution effect that depends on the EIS of the savers. Second, we have a time-varying risk term that captures the precautionary savings motive of the savers. Third, we have an inside wealth effect, which captures the redistribution from borrowers to savers because of the presence of private debt. And finally, we have an outside wealth effect, which is the wealth effect multiplied by a G multiplier. So let me get into this equation in more detail. First, note that the first three channels have a common component, which we name Y hat. Y hat is determined by the path of the nominal interest rate. After a contractionary monetary shock, Y hat always decreases, but eventually it increases above its long-run level. In fact, the present value of Y hat is 0, meaning that the first three channels affect the time of output, but not its present value. Then we have the parameters governing the channel-specific strength. These parameters determine how important each one of these channels is in the determination of equilibrium output. So in our calibration, I will talk about more this later. The time-varying risk component is pretty strong, while the intertemporal substitution effect is a bit smaller. What's interesting about this decomposition is that we can turn on and off each one of these terms and get an approximate response of output for different model specifications. For example, if we set epsilon lambda to 0, we are shutting down the time-varying risk channel, and none of the other terms are being affected. The final term is the outside wealth effect. Now, in these models, typically the change in aggregate wealth from a monetary shock is very small. And you can see that in the graph on the right, denoted by PE outside wealth effect. But it turns out that in general equilibrium, the wealth effect is amplified by the G multiplier. The G multiplier captures an interaction between inflation and wealth. When wealth goes up, aggregate demand goes up, inflation goes up, and the real rate goes down. This incentivizes agents to front-load consumption. In our calibration, we find that the Gini multiplier, the plot on the left, on impact is about 15, which implies that the impact of wealth effects in general equilibrium is greatly amplified, as you can see on the plot on the right. Now, this analysis is taking the outside wealth effect as given, but the outside wealth effect is determined endogenously. So let's zoom in its determination. So let's start with the nonlinear aggregate budget constraint. We have that the present value of aggregate consumption, which I denote by QC0, is equal to the initial value of government debt. Note that private debt doesn't appear because it cancels out in the aggregate, and the present value of disposable income, QY0. If we linearize this expression, we get an expression that's very similar to the intertemporal budget constraint I showed you at the beginning, but now I'm emphasizing the effect of discount rates. The discount rate is affecting both the assets and the liabilities of the household. It turns out that if we take the difference of the two, we get the government liabilities. That's how we get the initial expression where omega 0 depends on the government liabilities. Now, if we want to determine omega 0 in equilibrium, we have to note that the right-hand side variables, many of them are endogenous and depend themselves on omega 0. Our characterization allows us to express these variables in two different terms. One that depends only on the path of the nominal interest rate, and one that depends on omega 0. So plugging that into omega 0, we get the following important result. In equilibrium, omega 0 can be expressed only as a function of policy variables. Crucially, all the terms in this expression depend on fiscal variables. First, we have the revaluation of government bonds. Second, we have the present value of transfers. And last, we have the change in the interest payments on government bonds. What this expression is saying is that we need to bring fiscal data into the analysis if we want to get the magnitude of the outside wealth effect right. So let me close the model by bringing back the policy rules. So far, I have computed the equilibrium path of output and inflation for given paths of policy variables. I did this because I wanted to show you in a transparent way the different channels of transmission. Now I'm going to map this path to the policy rules. So remember that a monetary shock is a non-systematic innovation in the interest rule. So assume that the process for the innovation is given by this expression. We have that epsilon 0 determines the initial jump in the nominal rate. Psi m determines the persistence of the nominal interest rate sequence, and theta determines omega 0. Omega underline in the expression is just given by parameters. In the literature, we typically assume that theta is equal to 0, so we get a process for the innovation that's an AR1. But that's pinning down a particular value of omega 0. But I showed you before that omega 0 can be linked to the fiscal response to monetary policy. So instead of doing that, we're going to get fiscal data and discipline the parameters of this expression with data, which is what I turn to next. So let me briefly talk about the quantification. Our calibration follows closely Barrow 2009. We choose a risk aversion coefficient of 4, which implies an EIS of 0.25. Excellent, thanks. We have two new set of parameters to discipline. We have the fiscal response to a monetary shock, and we have the parameter governing the elasticity of time-varying risk. For the fiscal response to monetary policy, we take a standard VAR approach, and we augment it to incorporate fiscal variables. From that, we can get the initial response of government debt and the sequence of transfers, and we plug that into omega 0, and that allows us to discipline the parameters of the Taylor rule. For the asset pricing implications, we take our expression for the long-term bond and choose epsilon lambda to match the initial response of the 5-year yield on government bonds. It turns out that by doing that, we are also able to match several moments that we were not targeting. For example, the GZ corporate spread and the response of stocks to a monetary shock. So let me show you the quantitative performance of the model. The plot on the left has the response of output in our model and the different components. What you can see is that the outside wealth effect and the time varying risk are the most important contributors to the aggregate response of output in period 0. The graph on the right plots different versions of the model where we are turning on and turning off different channels. So to give you an idea of the importance of these channels, I decompose the total response into the different components. And what we find is that of the 105 basis points of initial response of output in our model, most of the effect is coming from time varying risk and private debt and their interaction rather than from the standard rank channels. And in the last minute, I just want to briefly talk about the quantitative success attributed to the standard rank model. Through the lens of our analysis, we say that we can conclude that the success is coming from a counterfactual fiscal backing embedded in those models and a high calibration of the EIS. In other words, what these features are doing is compensating for the lack of other amplification channels in reality, such as time varying risk and private debt that's absent in those models. So let me conclude. I presented a novel framework to analyze risk and heterogeneity in a linearized New Keynesian model. We find that time varying risk and private debt account for more than 80% of the response of output in period 0. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. The discussant is Giovanni Violante. Giovanni, if you can share the screen.
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, everybody. Okay, give me a second. I'm having trouble sharing my iPad, so I'm just gonna share my computer. Here we go.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So, so thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. It's a really impressive paper. I learned a lot from reading it carefully. I knew the paper. I talked about it with Nicolas some time ago, and I really liked it from the first time that I heard about it. Okay, so my discussion is going to be a little bit of kind of an inverse pyramid. I'm going to start a very big picture, and then I'm going to be focusing on the paper as the discussion goes along. All right, so the key question in the paper is a classic question in macro and monetary economics. What are the macroeconomic effects of monetary policy shocks? And you know, kind of broadly speaking, there are three approaches you can take. In the literature. The first one, which is perhaps considered the standard approach, certainly it's the class of models that is mostly used by central banks, is the New Keynesian approach, where the fundamental reason why monetary policy has real effects is the existence of nominal rigidities. And you're all familiar with the seminal work of Galli, Gertler, and Woodford, for example. The second set of models is a different one. It's a set of models where, which is based on kind of financial frictions, where the key idea is that monetary policy can redistribute risks across agents. agency of the economy. And here, classical sites are, the Brunemeyer-Sannikov framework, a recent paper by Drexler and others, and also I was thinking about the recent work. I mean, the body of work by Ricardo Caballero and Alp Simsek perhaps fits into this literature, broadly speaking. Then there is a third approach, which is the new monetarist approach, which thinks very, very deeply about money as a medium of exchange, about the kind of financial frictions that arise in the economy. Work by Nobu, Ricardo Lagos, Neil Wallace, and so on and so forth. So you can take kind of any of these three approaches to think about how monetary policy affects the macroeconomy. This paper belongs to the first approach, and in particular to a new generation of new Keynesian models that, for convenience, we're going to call kind of Hank models. What are the novelties of these Hank models? So there are some new features of this class of models relative to the kind of representative agent new Keynesian approach. The first key feature is the existence of an insurable household level income risk that leads to distribution of income and wealth. The second one is the presence of heterogeneity across households and therefore heterogeneous marginal propensity to consume. And in particular, this literature puts a big emphasis on the size of the marginal propensity to consume. This literature delivers large MPCs, which make the general equilibrium effects of monetary policy large and salient, as opposed to the representative agent model, where the MPC is very small. It's basically a discount rate. This literature also focuses on the importance of portfolio choices and balance sheet of households, and therefore leads to sort of the centrality of kind of wealth effects, which is one of the key points of this paper. Now, this literature emphasizes some new transmission mechanism beyond intertemporal substitution. And I think it's useful to mention them because then I want to reconnect kind of this slide to the Cramp and Silva paper. The first mechanism is income redistribution channel. Okay, so think about an increase in the interest rate, like the experiment that Nicholas described. So there's an increase in the interest rate. There is some redistribution from the borrowers to the savers. So from like high MPC agents to low MPC agents, which sort of contributes to amplify through this kind of reduction in aggregate demand, contributes to amplify the initial shock. The second channel is what is called in the literature the precautionary saving channel. So, an increase in the interest rate that reduces aggregate demand and reduces output could increase the amount of uninsurable risk in the economy, and therefore increase the precautionary saving motive and reduce aggregate consumption as a result. The third really important component of this model is that these models are in these models, Ricardian equivalence doesn't hold, right? Because of market incompleteness and borrowing constraints. And so essentially the fiscal reaction, the fiscal backing of the government really matters for the amplification or dampening of monetary policy. All these three channels are in this paper. The channel that the literature emphasizes that is kind of missing here, for example, is the fact that the marginal propensity to consume in these models is endogenous. In particular, it depends on the share of the hand-to-mouth household, the share of the constrained consumers, which is cyclical, obviously. I mean, it's counter-cyclical, it's increasing recession, and that means also the level of the MPC is endogenous and fluctuates. But let's kind of abstract from this because it's not in the paper. So these are the novelties of this class of models. This class of models is relatively recent, developed in the last 5 to 7 years, and so still a bunch of limitations. The main limitation, which is the one that this paper builds on, is really kind of many of these models, they lack aggregate risk and a serious macrofinance block. Now, macro with distribution aggregate shock is hard. Representative agent macrofinance in production economies is hard. I mean, even the representative agent macro finance in production economy is hard. And on top of that, sticky prices make sort of profits and dividends go the wrong way with respect to aggregate demand shock. And this paper has this problem as well, because if prices are sticky, there's an increase in aggregate demand, marginal costs go up, and profits are squeezed. And so that kind of goes the wrong way. So in these models, honestly, the transmission through asset prices is either completely missing or is wrong. Okay? Now, wrong in which sense? Now, consider kind of the standard Campbell shield decomposition. We say that dividends go the wrong way. Now, you can restore the procyclicality of dividends, for example, with wage rigidity, but you need a lot of wage rigidity. But let's say that we restore it. The risk-free rate channel of the Campbell shield decomposition is present, is there. Okay, so that is there. But the risk premiums channel in the standard literature is absent, is completely absent. There are exceptions. For example, my colleague Moritz Lenel and Rohan Kekre have a very nice paper where this is kind of at the heart of the mechanism, but there are kind of exceptions. So the paper, where the paper comes in? The paper comes in by kind of introducing disaster risk in this class of models, so making this risk premium really, really salient in the transmission mechanism. Now, this is important. Why? Because the transmission to asset prices is in the data. Okay, it's in the data. This is a paper, recent paper that uses Danish registry data and that kind of estimates the transmission of monetary policy across the distribution of households. And you can see that at the very top, the impact of monetary policy is very large. And these authors show that it's all coming from dividends, capital gains, and business income. Okay, so it's there. So we need really to understand it and to model it in kind of structural models. Now, so that's the first contribution of the author. The second contribution of the authors is that you know, they sort of develop all this in a way that is kind of tractable. And you know, the literature, this literature, heterogeneous agent and Keynesian models, is kind of split into branches, if you like. There is the quantitative literature. There's kind of these very big, rich models that are, you know, quantitatively they make, you know, credible, plausible predictions and analysis, but you know, they're complex and a bit of a black box. And then there is kind of an analytical Hank literature that tries to make simplifying assumption to model heterogeneity, but in a way that retains the model tractability and transparency. And this paper is in this kind of second stream of literature. In particular, there are three main challenges to overcome in this literature: the distribution and aggregate risk, which combined are very complicated. And the way this paper approaches this problem is by basically writing down a two-agent model, borrower and savers, and abstracting completely from idiosyncratic risk. You need global solution methods to solve these models in general. Again, the paper makes a very clever, I think, use a very clever trick, which builds on a paper by Cordacier, Ray, and Winant. So it kind of approximates, first order approximation around the stochastic steady state with disaster risk, but without monetary policy uncertainty. Okay, which is, I think it's a very useful way to proceed in this literature. The third challenge is this kind of asset price in a production economy type of challenge. And the way the authors get around this block is by modeling time-varying risk in a fairly ad hoc way. I'll come back on this point. And modeling disaster risk as an absorbing deterministic steady state and abstracting from capital. Okay, so all these assumptions make the model very, very tractable. And let me, I was betting on the fact that Nicholas would deliver a very, very clear presentation, and he did, in fact. So I'm just going to summarize the main result in one slide. Okay, so let's think about the response of output to an increase in the nominal rate. And you have all these effects. You have basically this kind of four effects, if you like. The first one is the standard intertemporal substitution, which is the orange line that comes from just that's a key effect of the representative agent model. Then you have what they call an inside wealth effect, which is related to what I called earlier the income redistribution channel. Okay, so this has to do with the fact that assets are in zero net supply within the household sector. There are some borrowers and some savers, and there is a redistribution. The interest rate goes up, so redistribution from high MPC borrowers to low MPC savers, and this amplifies the aggregate demand decline. Then you have this disaster risk. Now, because of the rule that states that when the interest rate goes up, disaster risk goes up, so there's a time-varying risk here, so does precautionary saving. Okay, so that's the precautionary saving motive, and that further pushes down aggregate demand for consumption. Finally, you have this outside wealth effect, which, as Nicholas explained very clearly, is nothing else than this counter present value of fiscal variables, and this relates to the it relates to the deviation from Ricardian equivalence. It relates to the fact that, in these models, it always matters how the government responds to a monetary policy shock. Here, government interest payments increase and fiscal transfers fall, and this reduction in fiscal transfers further reduce aggregate demand, in particular through this multiplier effect. Okay, so these are kind of all the effects in the model. So I have like 4 short comments that I want to sort of talk about. The first one is that the model combines basically time varying disaster risk and household debt. Okay, now the other kind of arching theme here is the wealth effects. Okay, and they're both in a way wealth effects. But I want to argue that they're a bit kind of 2 separate channels, and it's clearly not clear that they necessarily clear they should be in the same paper. So the disaster risk, as I said, affects the precautionary saving channel. And this is relatively new within the Hank literature, at least in terms of precautionary saving channel related to aggregate risk. The household debt affects the income redistribution channel from borrowers to savers and vice versa. And this is new within the analytical Hank literature, which typically adopts a zero liquidity limit, although Verning in his paper has some discussion of positive liquidity. Although in the quantitative literature, this is kind of well understood. In my paper with Kaplan and Moll, we have borrowers and savers, and we kind of emphasize this channel. But my main point is that the interaction between these 2 features within the model is kind of very weak. Is there, and the author showed that it's there, but it's kind of very weak. So why do they have to belong to the same model, the same paper? In some way, they're kind of 2 separate points. Okay, so here's an idea to kind of make the 2 channels talk to each other in a way. So imagine there is default risk in this model. Imagine that borrowers could default. Okay, and imagine that when the disaster hits, yes, I think I'm going to need an extra minute, I'm sorry, but I'll try to make it as quick as possible. And imagine when the disaster risk hits, households default, okay? So then what would generate is that, the time varying disaster risk would translate into, if the interest rate on borrowing is endogenous and it reflects the probability of default, an increase in the disaster risk would increase the interest rate on borrowing, and that would redistribute again away from the borrowers to the lenders, and that would generate, I think a salient link between these 2 channels, which otherwise, in my view, they're a little bit too separate. Okay, just a suggestion. Second, this is a bit of an obvious comment. The way in which the authors link the disaster risk to monetary policy is kind of a bit ad hoc. It is assumed that an expansion in monetary policy shocks makes disaster risk less likely to occur. Now, this is very nice because you can work through everything analytically, and you can calibrate the elasticity using the model's term premium and an empirical VAR. But why would the elasticity be invariant to policy or to the state of the economy, right? I mean, I think in finance, if you read the Tsai and Wachter annual review paper on disasters, it's common to assume that disaster process is exogenous, but from perspective of macroeconomists, I think it's a bit of a limitation of the paper. An ideal model would endogenize the occurrence of disasters, and there is, I think, a nice literature that models endogenous disasters by uncovering a really nice feature of the kind of the frictional unemployment model that basically they're very, very nonlinear dynamics, and so they can generate endogenously disasters. Finally, very quickly, let me just say that the model abstracts entirely from idiosyncratic risk. Okay, this is a problem. Well, idiosyncratic risk is much, much larger than aggregate risk, an order of magnitude larger, and it's also, I think, very natural to add it into this type of analysis. Why? Because as shown by Kruger and Lustig, and Konstantin Staffy as well, counter-cyclical idiosyncratic risk boosts the risk premium. So there's a very, very natural way, I think, of introducing risk premium, time-varying risk premium into these models by modeling cyclical idiosyncratic risk. So is it a big deal to abstract quantitatively from idiosyncratic risk? Well, there are some calculation of the welfare cost of eliminating idiosyncratic risk that suggests that if you eliminate all uninsurable idiosyncratic risk, you gain like 40% of lifetime consumption. So this is huge. So you would think it's really a first order loss to the model to eliminate, to abstract idiosyncratic risk. But careful, because the really important part of idiosyncratic risk that matters for the transmission mechanism here is the one that is related to the business cycle. Okay, and that's much smaller. It's an order of magnitude smaller, and it's basically comparable to the cost of eliminating, to the gain, sorry, from eliminating rare disasters. So the others in the end omit a component that kind of has the same order of magnitude are the ones they analyze. I don't know, just some food for thought. Finally, and this is my last comment. The fiscal response to the monetary policy shock really matters for amplification, as I explained. The key question is when the interest payment fall, or there's a kind of positive valuation effect on that, how does the government respond? Okay, respond through increasing transfers, lowering debt. How does it respond? The paper makes some progress, but the VR identification, in my view, is a little bit old-fashioned. Okay, so why not using the gold standard in this literature, which is kind of high frequency external instruments type of approach, or even like Romer and Romer. In general, this is a crucial component of this literature, so more work is needed to discipline this effect quantitatively. And the authors make some progress, but again, I think the approach is a little bit old-fashioned. So taking stock, it's an impressive paper. It's a very rich model, and yet it's transparent. I mean, you need quite a bit of patience to get to work through all the analytical expressions in the model. But in the end, it kind of pays off. They take some necessary shortcut to retain tractability. Overall, it's a successful effort. Where to go next? I think it's kind of obvious. The next step would be to think about QE, given that, here's this, the latest Economist, there is this free exchange article. There is in general a great interest among, commentators, policymakers, and economists in understanding whether QE increases wealth inequality by boosting asset prices or not. And this is, in a way, it's a natural framework to think about this question. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Gianluca. That was great. So how about Nicolas and Dejanir, if you want to take 1 minute to answer anything, if you want to answer anything big enough, and then we can move to questions. If you have questions, please raise your hands, and we can call you to unmute yourself and ask the question. Go ahead, Nico.
Right. So thank you, Gianluca. I think this was a great discussion. So I think the idea of introducing risky debt for households is great in the direction they were very interested. About the elasticity that's constant, I think it's probably more suitable to some questions for if you're thinking about small shocks in a regime that doesn't change, less suitable for doing optimal policy or studying where you have changing regimes. So I think that's issue of where this is applicable, but I think the direction of going, of thinking about endogenous disasters as in the line that you mentioned, or like in Prestipino, Kiyotaki, and Gartler, also would be quite interesting. Idiosyncratic risk is certainly very important, and was more the strategic decision to put the light on the aggregate risk in this paper. But I think that the methods that we use here to make this tractable also will be quite useful in a setting with idiosyncratic risk. I think it will play nice with the disaster setting. And I agree that a little bit more work on the fiscal backing is necessary and welcome.
Thank you, Dejanir. Any question? If you have a question, please raise your, okay, go ahead, Marcos. I had one, but you
just one clarification question about the evaluation of the outside liquidity or whatever the government debt position is. Is it correct? I mean, at least in our models, that boils down to the FTPL equation. And I was wondering to what extent the fiscal theory of the price level shows up here as well, together with the price stickiness, and whether you could allude on this aspect a little bit.
That's a great question. At the end, we do things in the standard active money framework, and that's why Nico was talking about that particular rule. It turns out there's an equivalence between both. You can either think this is like a fiscal theory setting where the government is basically giving you a path of fiscal transfers and choosing an exogenous path of non-interest rates. That would be the end of the story. If you want to think about the active side, as people are usually thinking, you show how if you do one extra step in choosing the rule properly, at the end of the turnout, you get the same. So if you really can properly think this in terms of fiscal theory, and everything we say will work as well.
So I have a quick question related to something that Gianluca mentioned, which is how the disasters affect credit markets. I know that you don't model it as such, but once you think about, Gianluca was referring to default probabilities, but you can also think about the role of collateral or the pricing of collateral, which also relates to what Gianluca is thinking about the idiosyncratic shock. So I was wondering whether you think about the role of collateral in pricing these assets, because that's going to affect credit markets, and that's going to affect also insurance, idiosyncratic insurance.
No, that's interesting. So one thing is the way that we're doing there, we're basically turning that off by assuming that the household debt is short-term and riskless, right? So as soon as you open up the door for long-term risky debt and the possibility of default, the risk premium would appear. And something similar to our inside wealth effect distribution between borrowers and savers that are coming now purely from the interest rate channel, now would come as well from the risk premium channel. This would basically give a boost to the risk premium channel in this setting, would be even more important. I think collateral on top of that, I think, would be an extra kick, right? So to make it even more important. But even if you abstract from collateral, by simply opening the door for risky debt, and now monetary policy is going to affect not only short-term interest rate, but also the spread directly. And given that our estimates, the risk premium responds strongly to monetary policy, this is probably very significant as well.
Thank you, Dejanir. Narayana, you have a question?
Yeah, great paper and great discussion. I had a question that builds on Gianluca's last point about QE. I guess I was interested if either the authors had some thoughts about how you would start to build QE into this framing, and how one would think about that. The other comment I had was, if we are going to go down this path, I think it's really important to have a full understanding of the government's asset position and the duration of those assets. The U.S. government at least owns a ton of land, for example, and some large fraction of land in the U.S. is owned by the United States government. But just in general, that's what QE is about swapping duration out. And so you really have to have a good understanding, I think, of the full asset position of the U.S. government as well. It's not just the tax side.
Definitely. I think this is quite interesting. I have some previous work on basically trying to explore exactly the fact that the QE operates by swapping these assets and basically redistributing risk in the economy. And my impression is basically connecting these ideas with what we have here would give you a role for QE. So you can even see here how when Nico were talking about the outside wealth effect, how that part of the story of the government, the debt maturity and composition already matter. When you're doing QE, we're basically changing the structure of the government's assets and liabilities. This also would play an important role. It is definitely plays nice also with the heterogeneous agents, where you're essentially shifting risk when you're buying assets in the market. You're shifting risk from the hands of the marginal investors to this constrained inframarginal investors. It's also we give like a real role for QE.
Yeah, and let me emphasize the identity of the wealth effect we find in the model. So the outside wealth effect, which is basically the present value of output, can be completely expressed in terms of policy variables, and in particular, fiscal variables. So the fact that the present value of output can be linked to fiscal policy, when in most of our monetary models, we were overlooking that. And then, yeah, it starts asking questions about, well, but then what's the asset position of the government and so on. That was a big surprise for us and a big result in itself.
Fantastic. Any other question? We have 1 minute for another question. All right. Okay, so we're right on time. So why don't we take a break of 10 minutes? Thanks a lot, the presenters and Gianluca. That was a great presentation and discussion. So let's take 10 minutes and we'll get back at noon. You can keep discussing in the meantime, but just remember that this is a live stream. See you in time.
Thank you, Gianluca, for the discussion. That was great.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It's a very nice paper. No, I agree with you, Nico. I mean, I found the effect of the, I mean, the result that you emphasize in the end, that if you do not discipline the fiscal backing in the representative agent model, you find much bigger impact on monetary policy shock. That's super interesting. That is something that I did not know.
Right.
At the same time, I think that we don't really know what we still don't know what is the right, empirically what is the right path for government variables in after a monetary policy shock. I mean that you guys have an attempt. I think I'm not an expert of EARs, but I think people who are would think your results are maybe not really state of the art in terms of the technique, and so
yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
I mean, did you try? I mean, at some point, I thought that maybe the reason why you didn't do like high frequency is because the data on the government budget constraint, they come at lower frequencies. They're kind of annual.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, at least. They may be quarterly.
Quarterly, yeah, we have quarterly data.
Yeah.
To be honest,
for the high frequency identification, ideally you need like monthly data.
You gotta keep it. So there was a little bit of bad dependence as well. We at some point were comparing our findings to the SG literature, and so then we basically borrowed their identification from then. Just to give an example, there's some recent work trying to look as well at this fiscal response to monetary shocks using like Romer and Romer that finds a relatively similar result. And the fact that at the end, when Nico emphasized the fact that the different fiscal backing matters, it matters quite a lot. So at the end, it's not that we're finding like small differences. So even if there's some uncertainty on the estimates that we're getting, it seems to be quite far the kind of the fiscal backing that the standard model is requiring from what we observe in the data.
Yeah, no, I mean you argue it's like 10 times bigger, no? So it's really like
the point estimates are very different. Yeah.
So but one thing I was a bit confused about is that about this result is that in my paper with Greg and Ben, we sort of show that in the representative agent model, at least the impact effect of monetary policy doesn't really matter on whether for the impact effect, it doesn't really matter whether the government debt is like 0 or positive. I mean, because of like the representative agent and Ricardian equivalence.
So there is a difference between Ricardian equivalence, which holds in a representative agent, but the fiscal backing also affects the representative agent. So that's the difference, right? So in part, one of the reasons why we start with the path of policy variables rather than the rules is that if we start with rules, we are used to thinking in Taylor terms, where like basically we hide the fiscal response. But we wanted to bring the fiscal response to the forefront because that's basically what we learned. Then we can map it back to Taylor.
Yeah.
But the model has a prediction about the fiscal response. And that's something that in principle, and I agree with you that we do one first step, if anything, we can go to the data and get it. We have to be careful.
Basically, there is a mapping between the kind of the path of the real rate and basically inflation and the fiscal, the path of the fiscal, which is what Marcus was. That's what Marcus' point about
exactly. Yeah.
So you can kind of go back and forth. And if you use the Taylor rule, you're sort of implicitly assuming something about the path of the fiscal variables.
Exactly. And then because of the standard assumption, as I said, like we are setting one parameter to 0, you are picking a particular value of the fiscal backing, but you can be even more general in Taylor. And now the discussion between fiscal theory and Taylor, it becomes a bit more blurred here because it's about like equilibrium determination. But at the end, what matters is what's the joint behavior of monetary policy and fiscal policy? And that you can do without taking a kind of extremist view.
But you don't have any bubble component here, like because of no idiosyncratic risk. Now, if you had idiosyncratic risk, like what we do, then you essentially push the real interest rate down below G, and then you can have a bubble component.
And let me say something about that.
So the one thing that I wanted to highlight on this, if I can resist, is one thing interesting about this setting is that it's perfectly possible for you to have R less than G and G less than N, and still you don't have a bubble component in the usual sense because of the risk premium.
Yeah, and something we do when we go to the data with fiscal variables is to see if the budget constraint, the intertemporal budget constraint of the government is satisfied, which in the paper we call the residual. And even though we claim that the residual is 0 in a statistical sense, if you look at the point estimate, you could potentially argue that the bubble component is also moving around with the monetary shock. So also getting more precision in the estimation can shed some light also on whether the bubble component is moving.
So, but what I don't understand, so what pushes the interest rate down? In your case, it's because you push your wealth to the guy with the low, or with the
because of the precautionary motive of the disaster, right? So the aggregate risk. So basically, it pushes it down.
But this precautionary motive doesn't push down the growth rate of the economy. So the growth rate is exogenous.
Here is exogenous, it's basically 0, right? So if the precautionary motive is sufficiently strong, the interest rate can be negative, the growth is 0, and the risk premium is positive. So that's what's referring to the R less than G less than N, as Ricardo or Ray's called.
Okay.
I mean, one possible challenge of all these mechanisms with precautionary savings when you have capital is that you need to make sure that basically these additional savings are channeled in non-productive assets. Otherwise, you get the opposite result of what Marcos is saying. If you then end up saving this thing in capital, then investment goes up and then everything goes the wrong way. So, I mean, adding capital add another layers of challenges to the.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's, I think, where idiosyncratic risk helps. If capital has idiosyncratic risk, you don't want to go into that necessarily.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, given your disaster is a big reduction in productivity, I was thinking, if you think in disaster as a financial crisis, which is, not necessarily a decline in productivity, but it affects prices directly and generates big redistribution. I guess, again, this is related to what Gianluca was saying. Maybe the idiosyncratic risks there are more prominent in those disaster times. So have you thought about, or is there a way to introduce a different sort of disaster?
I think at the end would be very similar. The only thing that matters at the end for us is that after the disaster happens, the savers, the guys pricing gas, is going to see a large drop in consumption. A very easy way to do it is putting it directly in the productivity, but you can do it in different ways. As long as the marginal investors, the ones that are pricing the assets, are basically seeing the possibility of this large drop in consumption in the condition of this disaster, could be a financial crisis, could be something else. basically everything they were saying here was true.
Got it.
But once you get into thinking about disaster, thinking about monetary policy, like immediately you start thinking about, or we started thinking about financial crisis, right?
Yeah.
And the exposure of the financial sector to interest rate risk, for example, right? And how that interacts with the possibility of a crisis. And this recent paper by Shurerik and co-authors was interesting in that sense. Like, I think it's one of the first empirical evidence we have that shows that actually, yeah, so that effect seems to be there. Of course, we need more work, but we need to